Welcome, everybody, from Canada and potentially abroad. If you can hear us and see our screen, maybe indicate in the chat that you can, just so we can cover off any technical glitches that we might be having. But let us know. We're happy to have you here, and we're excited to have another webinar, community of practice call related to rural and remote homelessness and housing first. And we're excited today to have some great folks with us to be able to talk about these things. As you know, or as I hope you know, the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness, who is sponsoring this webinar, is part of the Canadian Alliance's portfolio of organizations that we support in our allied networks element of the Alliance. And we've been excited to be working with them and doing lots of projects and those kinds of things. So we have obviously Shane Pelletier and Terry Lee Kelford, the co-chairs of the NAERHH, with us. And so I am going to actually very happily turn the time over to them, I think Shane, to get things rolling, and then we'll move on and get to the rest of our agenda for the webinar. There you go, Shane.
Hey folks, welcome. I see some names that I recognize in the chat or the attendee list, so welcome to the webinar. This morning we wanted to, this is our second installment of the series that we're doing on rural and remote homelessness for Housing First. We were blessed with some funding from ESDC that came through, and part of that agreement was that we would host some webinars with regards to the building of our Housing First Toolkit, or the adaptation or update to the Housing First Toolkit in a rural and remote capacity. So this is part of that series. We have another webinar coming in November, and more details will come out about that. But for this one, we're focusing on a right to housing. And I just wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about the Alliance. So the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness, or NAERHH as we call it, is a peer-led network. We're dedicated to preventing, reducing, and ending homelessness in rural and remote communities through advocacy, research, training, and peer learning. The Alliance, the idea of the Alliance started quite a while ago, but more formally came together in late 2018 as a result of a long-standing need in Canada for a national advocacy group focusing on rural and remote homelessness. Since that time, we've held regular monthly meetings. Our steering committee, or our work group, is broken out into a couple of different groups with some focus on people with lived experience, government relations, governance, and just different elements of the steering committee. We've been pretty good. Terry Lee's been really good actually to be coordinating those monthly meetings. So we've been holding them quite consistently, even through COVID. Shortly after we formed more formally, we became an allied network with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And what that means is that the Canadian Alliance took the step of kind of developing a group of allied networks. There's a more health-focused one, there's the right to housing one, people with lived experience, a women's homelessness focused one, and we're the rural and remote focused group. Along with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, we coordinated the first ever rural and remote homelessness stream at the 2019 National Conference. And out of that, we started to build our membership base and build a kind of a collective of people across the country that had that were working in the rural and remote space, and that had vested interest in the rural and remote homelessness. And through that work, in large part because of Terry Lee, we developed a position paper to advocate for increased funding through Reaching Home, and to advocate for some changes in the way that rural and remote funding and how the federal government addressed rural and remote funding. Terry Lee and I were lucky enough to be able to go to Ottawa and present the position paper directly with MP Adam Vaughan. And that was earlier in, well, it seems like a lifetime ago, but it was earlier in 2020. before COVID. And one of our more recent developments that we're really proud of is that we've developed or established a national rural and remote homelessness research committee, and that research committee is brought together with a bunch of different rural and remote researchers from across the country, many of whom you would probably recognize because they're the only ones that are doing the research in Canada, and it's a small group, but they're currently embarking on some research with regards to COVID and rural and remote homelessness in Canada. So we're looking forward to seeing some of that research come out. From our, once we kind of, go ahead, Wally, and switch to the next slide. Once we kind of developed, Terry Lee saw fit to submit an application for funding through ESDC. And we actually were awarded some funding to update the Rural and Remote Housing First Toolkit, and in collaboration with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Technical Training stream that Wally actually oversees, we're underway on that work now, and so keep your eyes and keep a lookout for that. So. Without further ado, we have a special presenter today. Her name is Michele Biss, and Michele is a person who is project manager of the National Right to Housing Network at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. She holds a BA, an honors BA, as well as a law degree from the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. As an expert in economic and social rights, she has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews at the Canadian parliamentary committees on issues related to poverty. Prior to her work with the Canadian Alliance, Michele was a policy director and human rights lawyer with Canada Without Poverty. In 2016, she graduated from the advanced course on economic, social, and cultural rights at, and I don't know how to say this, I'm probably going to butcher it, but she can correct me. I think it's Abo Academy University in Finland, and she has extensive personal experience working for marginalized groups, particularly women, persons with disabilities, newcomers, and Indigenous people, through casework, research, community-led education. In her local Ottawa community, she sits on the board of directors for Ottawa Community Legal Services, and she is a human rights lawyer called to the bar in Ontario in 2014. So Michele is going to take the webinar away and speak to us about rural and remote homelessness and how it relates to right to housing. Go ahead, Michele.
To be a part of this webinar. I'm joining, as Shane mentioned, from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe here in the city of Ottawa, very close to the federal seat of power, very relevant for our discussion today. Wally and Terry Lee and Shane have permitted me to take you on a little bit of a journey today. So hold tight. My plan in terms of my speaking notes is to do an introduction to the right to housing. So some background on what is the right to housing, where do these standards come from, how is Canada measured for our implementation of the right to housing, how we do that domestically within Canada, how do we actually make the right to housing real in the Canadian context, and then getting into a little bit of application, what it means in terms of the rural and remote context, and practically what it means in the context of Housing First, which I believe Wally will be chatting about a little bit later in this webinar. So let me start just by saying that at the very heart of the rights-based approach is what we call the rights bearer, the person who bears the brunt of the housing crisis. People experiencing homelessness, people who are experiencing the housing crisis, inadequate housing, core housing need. It must sound very familiar for those who are working in the Housing First world that the rights bearer, the person who is experiencing it, is at the center of the approach. The second thing that I want you to know about the right to housing is, as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing website puts it, the right to housing isn't just a rallying call. It's not just words, on a piece of paper. What it is it's a concrete normative framework, a legal framework of standards that can be implemented and measured for progress. So that's the second thing I want you to know about the right to housing. It's not just words on a paper. It is a normative legal framework that we can measure, that we can implement, that Canada is held to account for, as well as actors, including private actors. And the last thing that I want you to know about in this first slide on the right to housing is that all levels of government are responsible for implementation of the right to housing. So that means that we have local governments, we have provinces and territories, as well as the federal government, who have to adhere to this normative legal framework. But all of that can seem a little bit out there until we get into how we're actually measured for this, how we can make this real, and how we can make this a really tangible thing for folks. So with that, Wally, I'll get you to flip us to the next slide. Perfect. So where does the right to housing come from? So there's actually a number of international agreements that Canada has signed over the years that commit to what we call economic and social rights. And what I think is really interesting, and allow me to be a little bit of a legal nerd for a second, we have in Canada, as most folks know, this distinction between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. And strangely, this distinction, particularly in Canada, really favors civil and political rights. So something like the right to vote, for example. If someone was prevented from voting, we would see that as an automatic violation of rights. Something like freedom of expression, also a civil and political right. If someone was prevented from accessing their right to freedom of expression, we would see that as a major violation of rights. But for some reason, in Canada, we have relegated economic and social rights, like the right to housing, actually I'll say as well, the right to health, the right to food, as not rights that are a priority. We've pushed those kind of to the side. And that's actually kind of a strange thing. When you look at other countries and the way that they protect economic and social rights in their constitutions, in ways that people can actually exercise these economic and social rights, Canada actually stands out a bit as an outlier. And it's interesting as well because Canada has similarly signed a number of international human rights agreements committing to economic and social rights, in particular the right to housing. So the most obvious one I often point to here, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, came after the Second World War. You know, if we're talking from a very high level, this is a time when we're looking, at the world and deciding what is it that we want. What is it we want to be as a world? We saw the disproportionate effect of policies is an understatement after the Second World War, and we saw the need to come together under this framework of human rights. Then in 1976, we saw the ratification by Canada of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And in there is Section 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which commits to the right to housing, very relevant for our conversation. And then the third piece I want to point folks to in terms of international agreements is the fact that a number of the treaties we've signed on to commit to the rights of specific populations, of marginalized populations who disproportionately bear the brunt of the housing crisis. So as recently as 2010, Canada ratified the International Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and there you'll see it again is economic and social rights, including the right to housing. And some of the key principles are familiar within these international covenants. Principles like progressive realization. So the fact that the government always needs to be moving forward with the realization of the right to housing. They need to put in place policies one by one, always moving forward, but never moving backward. There's also another key principle here that's present in all of these international commitments to a maximum of available resources. And what that means is that governments should be putting forward a maximum of available resources when they're making their budgetary commitments to economic and social rights obligations, including the right to housing. I think that that's a really relevant conversation, especially when we're talking about distribution of resources and the way that we're seeing money prioritized for homelessness programs through different levels of government. And then last but not least, there's the principle of equality and non-discrimination. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory in some ways. We know that certain populations bear the brunt of the housing crisis, as I said, Indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, women, and we also know that that experience of homelessness or inadequate housing is also disproportionate given certain circumstances. So for example, Indigenous persons in rural areas likely do not have as much access to homelessness services as others in the country. So there's this principle of equality and non-discrimination. And what I think is really interesting in this context as well is that often when we're talking about the right to housing or Canada's new legislated right to housing, I often get questions about how this is different from the way that provinces and territories have human rights legislation that protects things from, for example, like landlords refusing to rent to someone because of sexual orientation, because of identity. And it's a little bit different, right? Because the right to housing applies both to discrimination and the need to pursue non-discrimination, but it also relates to the need for all levels of government in implementing laws, policies, and programs to be moving forward what I called before progressive realization, always moving forward, but in particular for marginalized groups. This importance of making budgetary decisions in line with economic and social rights. And last but not least on this slide, I have the point that I made earlier that the right to housing applies to all levels of government. So it applies to local level governments, it applies to provincial and territorial governments, and of course, it applies to the federal government. So this is my brief 101. I'm going to now flip to this question of how we're actually held to account for this. So how is Canada actually held to account for the right to housing? It's nice that we've signed on to these international covenants, but I often hear from folks, especially.
Michelle, you somehow muted yourself.
Of course I did. Sorry about that, everybody. I was going to say Canada is held to account for the right to housing internationally in three very particular ways. So the first is through reviews by the United Nations Human Rights Council and things like the Universal Periodic Review. So about every 5 years or so, the United Nations Human Rights Council measures how far Canada has come on our whole human rights record. So how far we've come in terms of migrant rights, how far we've come in terms of freedom of expression, and how far we've come in terms of the right to housing. And what happens is Canada has to submit a report to the UN Human Rights Council arguing how far they've come in terms of their progress. Civil society similarly puts forward what's called a parallel report. And then Canada actually has to answer questions in front of the UN Human Rights Council made up of representatives from different states. Another way that Canada is held to account is that it's supposed to be every 5 years, but often shapes up to be about every 10 years. For every treaty that Canada has signed with the United Nations, so for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Covenant on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that we have to, as Canada, submit a report to those treaty bodies saying how far we've come in those human rights obligations. And civil society has an opportunity, again, to submit a parallel report to say, well, actually, we need the national housing strategy to recognize the rights of rural communities and in particular specific populations in rural communities, at which point in time we get concluding observations or findings from these United Nations treaty bodies. And then we can use those concluding observations. And interestingly, in fact, those concluding observations are supposed to be used to interpret the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in different court processes, interestingly. But it's supposed to guide government actions, concluding observations. And last but not least, we have this Special Procedures Unit of the United Nations. And that's where you'll hear something about special rapporteurs. A lot of folks are probably fairly familiar with the role of special rapporteurs. It's been, I think, a big buzz in our housing space within Canada, in particular because the now former special rapporteur on the right to housing was Leilani Farha, who was a Canadian who also produced a film called Push that's been quite popular, I think, in the housing sector recently. And special rapporteurs have the opportunity to go into communities, to different countries across the world and see how they're doing in terms of compliance with human rights, write a report, and also provide these thematic reports. And these thematic reports are really useful to give us a sense of what these rights actually need in application. So beyond just saying the right to housing, what does it mean, for example, for a housing strategy to be representative of the right to housing? And it helps us get into the nitty-gritty of what the right to housing actually means. And now lastly, this question of, okay, thanks for taking these 10 minutes to talk about human rights internationally. What does this mean in Canada? Domestically, we now have something called the National Housing Strategy Act. Now, folks might have been watching as this happened because I think civil society, people across the country really stood up in an incredible way, I think, to make the National Housing Strategy Act happen. What happened was it was passed in June of 2019 after a massive push by civil society, using treaty body reviews, using the courts, and finally in an open letter and draft legislation that was created in 2018, we put forward what it would mean to actually legislate the right to housing through what is now the National Housing Strategy Act. And that was passed, as I said, in June of 2019. And there are three things I want you to know in terms of the mechanisms of the National Housing Strategy Act. There are three things really concretely that it created. The National Housing Strategy Act created a National Housing Council, and that National Housing Council is now responsible once they are appointed, and I will say that they have not yet been appointed. Once they are appointed, they will have the opportunity to provide oversight about how the National Housing Strategy is doing, to monitor progress, to make recommendations. Secondly, we have this infrastructure, again, not yet appointed, and in fact, the recruitment process has not started, though this legislation has been in force for a year. The Federal Housing Advocate, and the Federal Housing Advocate will be a really spectacular mechanism. It's going to be this, this body where civil society can bring forward systemic claims related to the right to housing to the advocate. The advocate will have the opportunity to do an investigation, and then based on the findings of that investigation, they can make recommendations to the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development. They can also have the authority to refer cases to a review panel made up of 3 members of the National Housing Council, and that review panel can further make recommendations to the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development that should be taken into account as they're making decisions about laws, policies, and programs. And also included in this oversight is this power to make sure that the right to housing is implemented through the National Housing Strategy and other housing policies. I could give a very long lecture about the ways that the National Housing Strategy and housing policies need to implement the right to housing, but here's what I really want you to know for this presentation. The National Housing Strategy has an obligation through the right to housing to make sure that programs are adequately meeting the needs of the most marginalized, of the people who bear the brunt of the housing crisis, of those who have thus far arguably been excluded from programs through the National Housing Strategy. And there's a really interesting opportunity, I think, to make sure that we use the right to housing and these new mechanisms to make sure that the next iteration of the National Housing Strategy, which we should be expecting next year, implements adequate measures for rural and remote communities, to make sure that application processes are more easily accessed, to make sure that certain populations, particularly Indigenous populations, have their needs met through laws, policies, and programs, and to make sure that there are accountability mechanisms to make sure that rural and remote communities are not consistently sidelined in favor of urban communities. And lastly, in terms of their oversight, and I think is quite relevant for folks on this call, there's a great opportunity to use these new mechanisms to make recommendations to address some of the systemic issues related to the right to housing. The ways, for example, that exiting the child welfare system might not account in rural communities and create an inflow into homelessness, the ways that we know that the systems that exist that perpetuate systemic violations of the right to housing, how we can make sure that those issues are prioritized and that they're changed in a way that's consistent with people experiencing violations of rights. Do you want to flip me to the next one, Wally? Okay, so why does this matter? Why have we taken this journey this morning? I'm going to highlight 3 reasons why I think that this might be really interesting for folks on the call. 1, implementing the right to housing means that the needs of rural and remote communities is met in the allocation of resources at all levels of the government. And this is particularly true for groups in rural and remote communities. It also means, the right to housing means that we also have to really take a step back when we're thinking about housing policy in Canada. We have to look at the way that existing housing systems further perpetuate violations of rights, how we need to rethink the way we consider housing in Canada and refocus from the idea of housing as a commodity to housing as a right that is essential to people. And we know, especially in the context of COVID, this is more important than ever, where we've seen different authorities, we've seen this play out, where housing has meant the difference between life and death for a number of people experiencing homelessness who have also been faced by COVID. Secondly, I'd like to point out the fact that service providers and others in rural and remote communities have a role to play in identifying systemic gaps for the federal housing advocate. I'd love to talk to folks about this more, and especially if you'd like to talk about this one-on-one, I am always available to chat this out. Of course, folks are putting a lot of thought into what the cases are that should appear to the federal housing advocate. We'd like to make sure as civil society that those are well coordinated, that we highlight some of the biggest gaps in our systems. And for folks who have seen these play out in rural and remote communities, I would love to connect with you. So I'm going to put that as a plug in the folks who are on this webinar's minds. And last but not least, I'm going to point out that there's this other way we can talk about the right to housing, now that we've taken so much time talking about this context, about the way that we can align things like housing first efforts with the right to housing, which really conceptually share some common principles. Wally, do you want to flip me to that? Perfect. So housing first and the right to housing. I will say I am by no means an expert in housing first. I will pass it on to my colleagues at CAH who are much sharper on this stuff, but I can talk a little bit about what I see in terms of reflection of the right to housing. And there's a couple of high-level principles that I think are really important. Housing first and the right to housing both prioritize an end to homelessness. They both prioritize action, investment, housing solutions in the context of homelessness. There's also this similar focus on a rights bearer, an individual approach. And one thing that the housing first approach can continually do and continually to do better at a local level is provide for accountability mechanisms and participatory decision making to make sure that programs are constantly reflective of those that they aim to serve. And last but not least, both this rights-based approach and housing first address at the core this issue of social inclusion and well-being. It's not just about providing housing, it's also about providing support. It's about making sure that our systems are set up in a way that promotes social inclusion. There's quite a bit that's out there in terms of written material on what it means to implement a rights-based approach at a local level. I didn't spend too much time on that today, but for folks who can get these slides after, there's a couple of hyperlinks there that might be really helpful as you think about what it means to really embody the right to housing if you're a service provider or a person at the local level who's trying to do their best to implement the right to housing. And just last but not least, one more point about housing first I wanted to make sure to make is in the context of the right to housing, we often look to models that have really effectively internationally worked to lower homelessness, to make a big dent in the systemic issues that we see. And it's really interesting because I hear in my international work often that, in fact, the housing first work implemented in Finland in particular resulted in Finland being one of the only European countries in past years to actually reduce homelessness. And there you can see and learn and the ways in which we see these different ideas and concepts flowing together, but all with this basis of focusing on rights bearers and centering our approaches and strategies on those rights bearers. So I will wrap it up. Hopefully I've only taken up my 20 minutes, and I think Shane is up next.
Thank you, Michelle. That was amazing. And I'm so pumped that you're in this position that you are, working with the Alliance in this capacity. I think going forward, looking at the legislation that's coming and the opportunities that you talked about, we're really going to need this element really close to all of the efforts that we put forward with regards to ending rural and remote homelessness. So thank you for sharing with us today. And I think I'm going to actually bring Terry Lee in here at this point to maybe talk a little bit about, Terry Lee, I kind of feel like I didn't really do the initial intro to the group justice. Did you have anything you wanted to add as far as the efforts that we're doing nationally?
No, I think you did a great job, actually. I think, I think the point to this today also is the series of webinars that we're offering. And so we really want to provide a broad base of information to rural and remote communities. So we want to make it specifically relevant to rural and remote and even small communities based on the size of your population. So Michelle, you did a great job, actually. Thank you for introducing rural into your presentation as well, because I know that was something we had talked about in advance. So I feel like, the conversations we have with rural and remote communities across the country, they often feel like they're left out of these national conversations that are happening. And so we just want to, one of the goals of the National Alliance is to bring this information to rural and remote and small communities and make it relevant for those communities as well. So, and provide opportunities for rural and remote communities to actually be able to ask questions of the folks doing the work on the national level. So hence the support of the Canadian Alliance as well, and Wally and those folks, and the networks actually are providing us with a really great opportunity to be able to do that. And Michelle and I and Shane and I were just talking about trying to do more sort of joint webinars with the networks that exist with the Canadian Alliance to be able to bring this information directly to rural communities. So no, you did a great job, Shane.
There is also a question, I think, for Michelle, and there might be some others that come up after that too. So I don't know if you want me to read that out, Shane, or.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Wally.
Okay. So this comes from Ed McNabb. And the question, Michelle, is if a level of government is not living up to these obligations, what can we do about it? For instance, Canada has been slammed by the UN for housing conditions among our First Nations citizens. What enforcement is available?
This is my favorite question to get, I will say. So thank you so much for asking it. That is a heavy question. What can we do about it? Well, I'd say that there are a couple of things that we can do. One of the challenges that we have repeatedly faced with the right to housing and the application of rights is that rights holders have been held for a long time out of the Canadian courts. It's been really hard when these issues come up for us to be able to use, for example, the Ontario Superior Court to make a claim to say these violations of housing, particularly for First Nations, Métis and Inuit populations, are so inadequate and such a clear violation of the Charter as it should be interpreted under the right to housing. And what's really interesting actually was back in 2010, folks might remember, there was a case that a group of people tried to launch called the Tanu Jaja case. And in that case, they made attempts to file a motion at the Superior Court that a lack of action to address homelessness was a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was an attempt to use the courts. And what we saw there was the government, the federal government and the Ontario government in that context filed what's called a motion to strike, which meant that the case was never heard. It was never allowed to be heard. And sadly, we had the justice at the Superior Court level say, that's right, it can't be heard here. And then we had it also go to the Court of Appeal in a 2-to-1 decision. They agreed, no, we're not even going to hear. And that was despite, I think it was over 10,000 pages of evidence on why this case had to be heard. And actually, no, sorry, the 10,000 pages of evidence was about the right to housing and application under the Charter. But I use that as an example to show the ways that, somewhat bizarrely, when we look at other countries, particularly Commonwealth countries and countries in Europe, have actually made it so that people can access the courts when there's a violation of the right to housing. But in Canada, as I said at the beginning, there's this strange imbalance that we have between civil and political rights and economic and social rights. So that has been a barrier for such a long time. Now, I say this as kind of the bummer part of this answer. The more optimistic part of this answer in terms of what we can do, well, we can use this new mechanism. So part of the way that the conceptualizing about how to get around not being able to access the courts was saying, we're not giving up the fight that we can use the courts, but we will push together to create this new role of a federal housing advocate, of a review panel through the National Housing Council, where we can put forward these facts, where we can exercise these rights, have decisions or recommendations rather come from a federal housing advocate, come from a review panel that we can then rally around and push the government to implement at all different levels. So the answer to what we can do is we can mobilize behind the type of cases that we're bringing forward to the federal housing advocate, in particular issues related to the disproportionate impact of the housing crisis on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Long answer to a short question. Do you have other ones? I think there's other ones in the chat. I don't know if Shane or Wally are walking me through them.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, let's just see here.
I have a question for you, Michelle.
Go ahead.
My question is kind of in the vein of what makes up adequacy, like who defines what is adequate in regards to, especially when you're looking at like Indigenous ways of being and Indigenous ways of living with regards to housing and what defines housing for Indigenous peoples, and like what a home is, and kind of that linkage between, you know, the difference between a house and a home. And could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I'll say one value in using the right to housing approach is that we have authorities, human rights authorities, that have kind of dug into this stuff really in depth and provide some guidance based on working with other countries and what has made sense and not. And I will say, in the context of adequacy for housing, we actually have those, folks might be familiar, there's seven pillars of the right to housing, including cultural appropriateness, security of tenure, that sort of thing. But beyond that, the rights-based approach kind of requires us to dig a little bit deeper. So having the pillars that we have, and then working particularly with communities to be able to determine things like what is cultural appropriateness, right? And I mean, one issue, of course, you know, as we all well know, in the Indigenous context, is that the solutions that we create in the Indigenous context have to be created and implemented by Indigenous persons, by persons who are directly affected. And so that interpretation of what is adequate, what is culturally appropriate, what is adequate for particular populations has to be measured by those who are directly affected. But one thing I will say is that beyond all measurements, beyond every, I think, intervention that anyone at the United Nations has ever said in the context of housing in Canada, there is no question that what we are doing in terms of Indigenous populations right now is wholly and completely inadequate. So beyond the question of how do we measure this, what is adequate, there's the reality that what we are doing now is not working, and we've been told that again and again, and it's only through a focus on particular groups and working directly with Indigenous populations that we will ever get to a point where we have progress it is our international shame.
And I have a follow-up question to that, if I could. I work in, I sit on Canada's National Advisory Council on Poverty. And so with the work that we do on that council, it seems like a lot of the time we bring forward in the Indigenous consideration of the Indigenous issues. The feds like to, and you know, in large part for good reason, but it's always kept distinct. It's always kept separate. And that has a lot to do with self-determination and self-government and the rights of governance for those distinct groups. When we're talking about the federal housing advocate, do you know if that federal housing advocate is going to be comprehensive with regards to all Canadians or, you know, all people rather than just those that are non-Indigenous or Indigenous? So have you heard any murmurings about how that might be?
I have. I've heard. That's a really good question. To lift the veil a little bit on what I know is going on, what I'm allowed to say is going on. One thing that I feel very encouraged by, even though we do not have a federal housing advocate or recruitment strategy for a federal housing advocate or a National Housing Council named, I can tell you that staff at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, where the federal housing advocate will be housed, and Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, there's a new wing of CMHC that's going to be in charge of the Housing Council and Review Panel. I feel very encouraged by conversations with their team in both the Human Rights Commission and CMHC. They seem to be putting together a lot of thought, a lot of infrastructure, and how to actively engage with these issues. They're just waiting for those appointments to be made to be able to make those specific determinations about how to integrate Indigenous perspectives. What I can say, not just perspectives, but rights, how the Indigenous piece can fit in, whether it's a separate piece, whether it's an integrated piece, how we can kind of do that. I suspect it's going to be a bit of an evolving thing as we figure out how this mechanism works. It's important to remember this is the first time in Canada that we've had the ability to exercise an economic and social right. This is major implications for the way that people access food in this country. It has major implications for women's economic and social rights. It has major implications for income security. This is the first time we've done this. And so we actually, as civil society, as housing providers, as people at other levels of government, have some power in seeing the way that this is actually set up and structured to make sure that it reflects what we want it to do, because the implications of having this new access to justice mechanism essentially can be pretty profound.
So I apologize, you're going to hear a little bit of noise in the background here because I've got some construction going on, but I don't see any other questions. There was another one that somebody has, Michelle, that they want to connect with you privately about. So be prepared to hear from those individuals. But yeah, I don't see any other questions. So maybe we'll just throw it out there. If anybody has any last minute questions at the moment before we go on to the next piece, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, maybe Wally, I'll put out there a plug, an opportunity for a shameless plug for the National Right to Housing Network. While folks are thinking if they have any more questions, just to say, if you're interested in joining the Right to Housing Network as well as the Rural and Remote Network, the National Right to Housing Network is hosted at www.housingrights.ca. It's a fairly easy URL. And with that, you can join the network, get updates on what's happening with the Federal Housing Advocate and Council, how we're hoping that this is all going to work together, and also have the opportunity to join some working groups as we figure out what kind of issues need to be prioritized for the Federal Housing Advocate and try to help organize what is a really large community and figuring out how we can adequately do this together. So housingrights.ca.
Awesome. Shane, anything else from you or Terry Lee before, or do you want me to jump in?
No, we can jump into the last portion of the meeting, and thank you for all the attendees. Yeah, again, just if you have any questions for the month, Michelle, I saw that Wally typed your email into the chat window there. So I think we're moving on to the Housing First Toolkit, if I'm not mistaken, or Housing First 101. That's right. Okay.
Yeah. So just so people are aware, we were going to talk for a few minutes just to give some brief input about just a refresher on Housing First 101, and then I'll talk at the end a little bit about where we're at with the toolkit and what that means. But in order to do this, it's important that people participate. I'm doing this a little differently, so we're going to do this by way of a poll or a survey, a live survey. So what I'd like you all to do is, whether it's on your computer or on your phone, preferably on your phone, if you would type this address into your URL on your phone. Now, don't make the mistake that a lot of people do by putting it into the Google search bar. That's not where it needs to go. You need to type it into the website address line on your phone web browser. And so if you'll go there, there is already a presentation that has started. And so you should be able to see it on the big screen now. And so I'm just going to ask you a few questions. And once you log in, if people would start just responding to the first question you see, you should be able to just click your answer, and then what I'll do is I'll tell you a couple of pieces of information about each question, and then we'll move on to the next question. So we've got there's about 40 or so people that are left on the line. Now that includes what's listed, or what looks like 6 panelists, but so there's about 35 or so participants, and we have 9 of you who have entered answers so far. So the more of you that would participate, the better. Now again, this isn't mandatory. It's not like you're going to be refused the right to see this recording or anything afterwards if you don't. But we have our ways. So please, if you would, participate. So we're up to 10. Woohoo! So I'm not going to wait too terribly long because we don't have lots of time. So Housing First is not a housing program. True or false? And so right now we've got 55% saying that's false. So essentially you're saying Housing First is a housing program. And so very interesting. So we got about 13 responses. So I'm just gonna, well, maybe more will come in. I'm just gonna provide you the answer. The answer to this question, and again, I apologize for the staple gun in the background. The answer to this is true. Housing First is not a housing program. The reason that we say this is because Housing First is not housing only. And the real core component of Housing First is about what comes after housing. There's an interesting little analogy, a video analogy that I created around Housing First and baseball, which suggests that housing is actually just getting to first base. And a lot of times we think of it as that's the home run, but it's just first base. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to occur after housing. Samson Barris would tell you Housing First is actually a recovery program, not a housing program. So that's why we would say this statement is true. All right. So we've got, out of 18 people who've answered that question, we're at oh, see, now some are answering because they know the answer. That's not fair. So anyways, I'm going to go on to the next question. Next question. Choice in Housing First means that the participant should have choice in housing, services, supports from the program, treatment, or I think or lifestyle, or all of the above. So we have 20 folks. Everyone has said 100%. Okay. So the answer to that question is correct. It's F, all of the above. I think sometimes people have this sense that choice is only limited because of certain things, which that's interesting because I'm going to have another question that's related to that in a second. But all of those aspects that we talked about, people should have choice in what happens in their lives with those. We eliminate preconditions in Housing First. We eliminate the extra rules and guidelines that cause people to be limited in the choices for their own lives that they make. So the next question, when it comes to choice in the previously mentioned areas, a participant should be able to choose, no matter what, the type, location, frequency, and intensity levels associated with them. So is that true or false? So, sure, by the way, that's another language for true. But it looks like we have 100% of people so far saying that this is true. They should be able to choose no matter what, the type, location, and intensity levels and so forth associated with all of those areas. So this is where it gets a little confusing, and I'm gonna throw you off a little bit, because the actual correct answer to this is false, because there are factors and conditions that come into play that make it impossible for people to have choice no matter what. There's also other factors such as developmental levels, cognitive levels, and there are things like some of our participants have FASD challenges, which actually best practice with FASD is not to give people too many choices or too much choice because it's overwhelming for them. So there's lots of factors that come into play. Another example is if you've housed someone in the same type of housing multiple times and they keep destroying that housing, and there's all kinds of problems associated with it, and those things aren't changing, but that person wants to go back to the same type of housing. Well, you know what, as an organization, you don't have unlimited funds to keep paying for repairs and so forth. And through that experience, we've learned that that type of housing isn't going to be as effective as maybe other options. And so it's important that we provide other options. So even though people should have choice in all areas of their life, choice can be limited, just like with our own children. Sometimes we limit the amount of choice that we are providing because of the specific circumstances around each individual. So going to the next question. Housing First programs should incorporate some aspect of 24/7 support. So far we have, it's changing a little bit. So we've got 19 or 20 folks who have answered so far. Overwhelmingly, people are saying that that answer is true. And I will tell you that the correct answer for that is true. It's not a must, but it is a should. And the reason for that is because people, again, it's about housing first is not housing only. So those supports that come after they've gone into housing, we need to have a way, especially since many of the problems that people face in housing happen after 5 o'clock and on weekends. And so we've got to have some way for folks to be able to just contact someone in case there's a problem. And sometimes that quick contact is all that they need to be able to get past a situation, just to talk something out. Another reason 24/7 support is also valuable in Housing First is it can be a conduit for landlords to be able to connect to somebody. And oftentimes that's all landlords need, is just to know that they can connect with somebody. And that mitigates many of the problems. So 24/7 support is important. And it's also part of our fidelity checklist in relation to Housing First. Next question. In Housing First, the program should not, well, I got to move everybody's pictures here, should not be integrating tenancy contingencies. The only contingency of tenancy should be the adherence to a standard lease or rental agreement. So most people are saying true. Oh, it's changing a little bit now. So about half and half. The answer to this question is true. Really, if we can, the only contingency of someone's tenancy should be their standard lease or their rental agreement. The reason for that is about Housing First, again, is not putting in preconditions. It's about separation of housing and supports. Okay, people's housing should not be contingent upon their participation in programs or things like that. And also, people's participation in your program should not be contingent upon their tenancy or upon being housed. So we keep those two things separate. Housing is housing, and we just talked about the right to housing. If we think about the right to housing, then there should not be any other contingency of tenancy. People have a right to appropriate, safe, affordable housing, and we need to assure that that's where we stand as from that Housing First philosophy. The next question, Housing First program must be able to directly provide participants with services and supports that cover a broad range of life goals. So far, looks like 100% are saying that this is true. Some slight movement now on that. As people's answers filter in, what I will tell you is this is a bit of a trick question. And so the emphasis on the word must, it kind of throws people off, and directly providing participants with services. The answer to this is actually false, but I understand why people would say true. The reason it's false is because it's very difficult for all Housing First programs to be able to directly provide such a broad range of services. Where this question is true is that we should be trying to make available to our participants programs and supports that cover a broad range of life goals. So that could be through brokering of services or connecting people to services. And part of what that means is trying to install and instill formal agreements with formal linkages with the programs that provide the services that you can't provide directly, meaning memorandums of understanding or terms of reference between two programs so that you can help individuals get access to programs that they typically can't get access to. Many communities have a fairly significant level of supports, but they're not always accessible to the people that we're trying to serve from the homeless population. So creating those linkages and trying to connect with programs so that you can broker them is what's important. But not all Housing First programs are able to directly provide all of the programs that are needed. Next question, all people, regardless of their circumstances, with proper supports, can improve their lives. Do we believe that's true or not? Remember, we said all people. And don't let what I'm saying throw you off necessarily. I'm just providing context. So it looks like there's a vast majority that are saying the answer to this question is true. So it is true. This is an important position of values that people who are providing Housing First services should be undertaking. We have to have this belief that all people can change their lives, but the key is with the proper supports. And they haven't always been able to have those proper supports. So as long as we can work with them and build things from a participant directed perspective, we can incorporate supports that are going to be helpful for these people. Oftentimes people say that there are some people who have been homeless for a long time, that they are just hopeless and they feel hopeless and that they're not ever going to change. And I don't believe that. I believe that they feel beaten down and they feel like life is a struggle. But I also believe that hopelessness, true hopelessness, is where people actually begin to decide that their life isn't worth living anymore. And so I think as long as these folks are breathing and moving about on our streets or in our communities, there is at least a small ember of hope there. And it's our job to, again, work with them on their levels to become a fan, to fan that ember and help them to see that things can be different than they have been. So yes, we need to believe that all people can improve their lives if they have the right supports. Which of these items is not included in Housing First recovery orientation? a trauma-informed approach, harm reduction, participant-driven goals, mandatory home visits, or none of the above? Which is not included? So things are shifting. Things are shifting. I think people are starting to pay attention to wording a little bit, which is helpful. So the answer to this question is D, mandatory home visits. Now, you will hear people talk about housing first and about how important home visits are, and I will concur. Home visits are essential, but a housing first program, if they are adhering to this concept of no preconditions and that we are separating housing and services, we can't say that our home visits are mandatory. And a lot of people who are implementing housing first follow this idea that if a person isn't letting us come and do home visits, then we need to discharge them from our program. And I would ask you to seriously consider what the motive of that really is, because I would say there are reasons that are deeper down of them not letting you come and do home visits that have nothing to do with their wanting housing or wanting support. I would say it's related to trust. I would say it's related to a lot of factors that you need to give it time, and you need to work hard to try to instill in them that things are going to be different and that they can trust you. So if we start eliminating people from our programs because they're not letting us come and do home visits, especially in the beginning, then we're not really doing housing first. Next question. Rent subsidy is not necessary in housing first programming. True or false? Okay, so we have 50-50. This is also a bit of a trick question. But again, remember, I'm not saying it's mandatory. The answer to this question is false. It is necessary. We often tell programs that are just starting housing first operations that they should base their target numbers on the number of rent subsidies that they have available, because what we all know, I think, is that the funding that's generally available for people who are experiencing homelessness in housing isn't enough to cover rental costs, especially from your market rental standards. And other housing, there's generally not enough available to make that affordable housing available to them. So it is necessary. No, it's not mandatory, but it is necessary. It's important, and you just about can't operate housing first without rent subsidies for all of your participants. So just very quickly, I know we've gone over a couple of minutes here. It is important to include peer specialists in your housing first program. Yes or no, true or false? Absolutely. It's absolutely important to include peer specialists. And I think we're learning more and more about the value of having peer support built into your program as regular staff. It's an important part of your program structure and operations. And then last but not least, housing first is all you need to be able to end chronic homelessness. True or false? So far, 100% of people are saying false. And the answer to that is absolutely false. It's an important, extremely important component, an essential component, but it is not all we need, because the thing we need to remember is housing first was designed for those who do not fit into the normal standard avenues of accessing housing and supports. And so housing first was not meant to be the silver bullet to address all people who are experiencing homelessness. It is a program that's based on those who are dealing with the more complex, challenging issues and needs. So that's just a little bit about housing first. Also, just in regards to the toolkit and where we're at with that, we have had, obviously from COVID, we've had some delays in some of the work that we're doing, but right now we are in the process of gathering research and information about rural and remote homelessness and and Housing First. And we are also working to gather people who are willing to be participants in sort of a pre and post fidelity assessment process. And we have a few folks who have agreed to do that, and they have that information and have started, but we're looking for probably 6 to 8 more programs or communities who either are already operating Housing First in their rural area or who are very interested in doing that. And so one of our goals is to create a rural and remote specific Housing First fidelity checklist that can augment the standard Housing First fidelity checklist. That in part is going to help to inform this addendum that we're going to be creating that will be added on to the existing Canadian Housing First Toolkit, which will include this checklist. It'll include other details around the operations and how to go about putting together and supporting a Housing First program in a rural and remote area, the kinds of adjustments and tailoring that can be made, as well as have some resources and links to information around different policies and those kinds of things that can be incorporated into a Housing First program in a rural or remote perspective. There will be a report that will come out along with this as well. And but we are looking for some additional time to have this be completed, because of the challenges associated with COVID. So at that, I'm going to turn it back to Shane and Terry Lee to finish things off, and then we'll let you folks get out of here.
Thanks, Wally. That was a lot of fun. I may or may not have got 100% on all of those questions. Terry Lee, I'll let you close out. I feel like we haven't received enough of your smiling face.
Trying to make you do all the work, Shane. Well, I just want to wrap actually by saying thank you to Wally and Michelle as well. Again, Michelle, you did a great job of introducing sort of how Housing First relates to rural communities as well. And I think, that just fits with what we're trying to do with the National Alliance, is to really advocate for adequate funding and supports and resources and services for rural communities across Canada. We feel like, there's definitely a lack of services in rural communities, and we need to do what we can to advocate for those. So thank you very much for that. Wally, thank you as always for helping us with this toolkit. It's certainly been a chore in the middle of a pandemic, but just a big shout out to everybody who participates on these webinars as well. There's going to be another webinar coming up on Housing First. We're hoping to have a presenter of a Housing First program being done in a rural community. So we're really looking forward to that. Look for that in the next probably 4 to 6 weeks. We're going to try to organize that. So, and as Wally said, we're just looking to recruit more organizations that are doing Housing First in rural communities. Just to finish up then, if you want to go to our website at www.NAERHH, so National Alliance to End Rural Remote Homelessness, you'll find an opportunity to sign up for our membership there. And we will actually be in the next few weeks recruiting folks off our membership to join working groups for the National Alliance actually. So please get involved if you can, if you've got some time to spare. Shane, thank you, my fellow co-chair, for all your support and help during these workshops. So that's it. If anybody else has anything to say.
The only thing I'll add is just a reminder, I put it in the chat, but this recording and the slides will be made available through the TTA website. I'm not sure if we're uploading this kind of stuff to the NAERHH.
Yeah, we are, for sure. Yeah.
So we'll probably make it available there as well, so people can get access to that. It'll be ready probably by tomorrow morning.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a good day.
Bye. We
should invent a Zoom playoff music, for when everybody's kind of filtering out. Intro.